The crystal champagne glass shattered against the polished marble floor with a sharp, deafening crack, splashing expensive amber liquid all over the worn leather shoes of the elderly woman. "What's your rank, Grandma?" Lieutenant Garrett Vance mocked, his voice dripping with pure venom as he stepped closer, towering over her. "Are you the new toilet cleaner? Or did a poor black woman like you just sneak through the kitchen doors to steal the leftover caviar from the general's tables? Look at yourself. You don't belong in this room. Get on your knees and clean this up right now, before I have security throw your old body out into the freezing mud where you belong." The old woman remained completely still, her eyes calm, which only fueled his disgusting arrogance. Garrett threw a dirty cloth at her face and spat on the floor. "What? Are you deaf as well as old? People of your color used to know how to obey a man in a real uniform. Don't look at me with those tired eyes, Grandma. Your very presence in this room is polluting the air our heroes breathe. Now wipe my boots, or I will personally drag you out by your white hair." He didn't know that the fragile woman he was humiliating was a living legend. He didn't know that in exactly 12 minutes, the entire room would freeze in absolute terror when the Joint Chiefs of Staff walked in. Do not miss a single second of this jaw-dropping story, because the ending will satisfy you completely. Before we begin, please drop your current location and local time in the comments below, and subscribe to our channel to support real justice. The grand ballroom of the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C., was an ocean of blinding luxury on the night of the 14th of October 2026. This was the annual Defense Leadership Gala, a highly exclusive event where invitation cards were harder to obtain than classified Pentagon blueprints. The air inside the vast hall smelled heavily of expensive French cologne, freshly polished brass buttons, and the quiet, dangerous arrogance of absolute power. Above the 300 distinguished guests, massive crystal chandeliers hung from the ornate ceiling, throwing fractured beams of golden light across a room that collectively controlled billions of dollars in military budgets. Waiters wearing immaculate black vests glided through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with glasses of vintage champagne and tiny plates of white sturgeon caviar. Every corner of the room whispered of high-stakes strategy, multi-million-dollar defense contracts, and top-secret operations. In the center of this elite gathering stood Lieutenant Garrett Vance. At 29 years old, Garrett was the perfect embodiment of military perfection, a man whose life had been a series of easy victories handed to him on a silver platter. His jawline looked as though it had been aggressively carved from a recruitment poster, his broad shoulders filling out his navy dress whites with an intimidating posture. Pinned precisely above his left breast pocket was the gold trident, the sacred insignia of the Navy SEALs. It was a symbol that made regular civilians stare in awe and colonels pause out of pure respect. Garrett touched the gold pin every few minutes, adjusting its angle slightly, even when it didn't need adjusting, ensuring that every light beam in the ballroom caught its glare. He belonged to a powerful military family, with deep connections in the Pentagon, a fact he never allowed anyone to forget. To Garrett's right stood his loyal satellites, Petty Officers Logan Foster and Wes Callahan. Logan, a stocky man with a permanent sunburned neck, was scanning the room for wealthy defense contractors to impress, while Wes, leaner and quieter, sipped his third glass of top-shelf bourbon, calculating how many high-ranking officials he could introduce himself to. They were highly trained operators, battle-tested and lethal, but tonight they were profoundly bored. Bored young men with gold tridents on their chests and endless alcohol in their systems were always a volatile combination. Garrett laughed loudly at a joke Logan made, his voice carrying over the classical melody of the string quartet playing in the far corner. He felt completely untouchable, a god in a uniform of glowing white. Then, Garrett's eyes drifted toward the hallowed perimeter of Table 12. Table 12 was reserved for high-ranking flag officers, but tonight it was entirely empty except for one solitary figure. Sitting perfectly erect in a plush velvet chair was an elderly black woman. Her name was Evelyn Carter. To anyone who did not know her, she looked like an ordinary grandmother who had somehow wandered into the wrong building. She wore a simple, dark navy blazer that was noticeably worn at the cuffs, entirely devoid of pins, stars, ribbons, or any insignia of authority. Her silver hair was tied back into a neat, modest knot, and her deeply lined face bore the marks of many decades of quiet endurance. She had no security detail, no uniform, no flashy jewelry, and no wealthy escort. She merely sat there, holding a plain glass of tap water, looking through the crowd of glittering elites, as if she were completely invisible to them. To a man like Garrett Vance, her very existence in that room was a geographic error. It was a stain on the immaculate canvas of the military elite. He swirled the amber whiskey in his glass, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the old woman. The alcohol in his veins amplified his natural sense of supremacy, turning his boredom into an ugly, aggressive curiosity. "Hey, look at table 12, Garrett whispered, nudging Logan with his elbow. "Who let the maid sit at a flag officer's table? Did the hotel staff run out of break rooms?" Logan snorted, his eyes widening as he looked at Evelyn. "Man, she looks like she got lost on her way to a Sunday church service. No badge, no name tag. How did she even pass the 3-star security screening at the front entrance?" "That's exactly what I'm going to find out," Garrett said, a cold, arrogant smile spreading across his handsome face. "The Pentagon spends millions on security protocols for this gala, and we have a random civilian sitting where generals eat. It's an insult to the uniform." Wes Callahan glanced at the old woman, noticing the absolute stillness in her posture. She hadn't moved a muscle, hadn't looked at her phone, and hadn't flagged down a waiter for a drink. There was a profound, unbothered dignity in her stillness that made Wes feel slightly uncomfortable. "Garrett, let it go," Wes muttered under his breath, grabbing his friend's arm. "She's just an old lady. Maybe she's someone's grandmother. Don't make a scene here. The room is full of brass." "I'm not making a scene, Wes. I am merely enforcing protocol," Garrett replied coldly, pulling his arm free with an aggressive jerk. "I am a member of SEAL Team 9. I've conducted 5 highly classified Black Ops missions in the frozen wastes of Antarctica. I've bled for this country, and I didn't spend my youth surviving hell just to share a ballroom with a stray civilian who didn't pay the price of admission." Garrett adjusted his gold trident one last time, squared his shoulders, and began walking directly toward table 12. Logan followed closely behind, eager to watch the entertainment, while Wes stayed back, holding his glass tightly, an uneasy feeling growing in his stomach. The golden light of the chandeliers caught the back of Garrett's crisp white uniform as he marched toward the old woman, completely unaware that he was stepping directly onto a landmine of his own creation. The heavy, rhythmic thud of military boots stopped exactly 2 feet away from where Evelyn Carter sat. Garrett Vance stood over her like an apex predator, his chest pushed out, intentionally casting a long, dark shadow over her small frame. He didn't offer a polite smile or a respectful greeting. Instead, he stared down at her silver hair with a look of supreme disgust, as if her presence was a personal offense to his lineage. "What's your rank, Grandma?" Garrett asked, his voice deliberately loud, designed to slice through the surrounding chatter and draw the attention of nearby tables. Evelyn did not flinch. She slowly brought the glass of water to her lips, took a single, controlled sip, and set it back down on the white tablecloth without making a single sound. Only then did she raise her head, her dark eyes meeting his fierce gaze with a calm, penetrating focus that should have warned any rational man to step back. But Garrett was not a rational man. He was a man blinded by his own myth. "I don't believe I owe you an answer, young man," Evelyn replied. Her voice was remarkably steady, possessing a rich, deep texture that lacked even a tremor of fear. Garrett let out a short, mocking laugh, turning back to look at Logan, who grinned on cue. "You don't owe me an answer? Grandma, look at this badge on my chest. I am a Navy SEAL. I am 6'2" of pure American lethality. My dress whites are sharper than a combat blade, and I've earned the right to ask anyone in this building who the hell they are. Meanwhile, you look like you just sneaked through the kitchen doors to steal the leftover caviar from the general's tables, because a poor black woman like you couldn't afford a ticket to see how the real world operates. A painful silence began to radiate outward from table 12. A senator sitting at the adjacent table stopped mid-sentence, his wineglass hovering near his mouth. Two defense contractors lowered their voices, their eyes darting over to the confrontation. Garrett felt the eyes of the room turning toward him, and the audience only fueled his toxic theatricality. "Let me make this simple for your old brain," Garrett continued, leaning down so close that Evelyn could smell the heavy scent of premium bourbon on his breath. "This gala is for the protectors of this nation. It is for people who have authorized airstrikes, led battalions, and bled in dirt. It is an invitation-only, egos mandatory event. You have no uniform, no medals, no name tag, and no badge. You are nothing but a stray civilian who probably snuck past the front security because they thought you were part of the cleaning crew. So, I will ask you one more time, what is your name, and what branch did you serve in? Give me one single reason why I shouldn't have the military police drag your old body out into the freezing mud right now." "I am enjoying my evening, Lieutenant," Evelyn said softly, her expression remaining entirely unreadable. "And if I were you, I would turn around and walk back to your friends before you say something your career cannot survive." "My career?" Garrett sneered, his face flushing red with sudden anger. The fact that this old, defenseless woman refused to be intimidated by him dug deep into his fragile ego. He had spent his entire adult life being told he was exceptional, an elite warrior whose path could not be crossed by ordinary citizens. "You think you can threaten me? I'm part of SEAL Team 9. I've operated in Antarctica, where the cold kills men in seconds. I've given up my youth, my sleep, and my sanity for that gold pin on my chest. It cost me everything, and I absolutely loathe the sight of someone sitting at a flag officer's table who hasn't paid the same blood price I did." Evelyn tilted her head slightly, studying his enraged face the way a seasoned professor studies a student who has confidently written the absolute wrong answer on an exam and is standing there waiting for applause. "You think everyone who belongs in this room paid the exact same price you did, Lieutenant?" she asked, her voice dropping to a lower octave, sending an icy chill across the tablecloth. "I think everyone who belongs here paid a price. Period," Garrett barked back, slamming his hand down on the edge of the table. The vibrations caused her water glass to rattle slightly, a sharp metallic ring that caused several more heads to snap in their direction. "And you haven't paid a dime. You're a tourist, an intruder. Look at your skin. Look at your clothes. You're a historical mistake in a room like this. People of your color used to know how to show respect to a man in a real uniform. But I guess nobody taught you manners in whatever dilapidated neighborhood you crawled out of." Logan shifted his feet behind Garrett, his grin fading slightly as the language crossed from standard military bullying into something much darker and more dangerous. He opened his mouth to say something, but Garrett was already entirely gone, consumed by a desperate need to crush the old woman's unbreakable composure. Evelyn sat perfectly, impossibly still, her breathing remaining regular, a sniper waiting on a rooftop for the perfect moment to pull the trigger. The suffocating tension inside the grand ballroom was becoming too heavy, even for a woman of Evelyn Carter's immense discipline. Without saying another word to the furious lieutenant standing over her, she gracefully stood up from table 12. She adjusted the cuffs of her dark navy blazer with the precise, deliberate movements of a surgeon placing an instrument on a sterile tray. She didn't look at Garrett. She didn't acknowledge his glaring eyes. She simply turned her back on him and walked toward the tall glass doors that led out to the open-air terrace overlooking the Potomac River. The autumn wind outside was sharp and biting, sweeping across the dark, slow-moving water below, but Evelyn welcomed the cold. It washed away the toxic smell of expensive cologne and cheap whiskey that filled the ballroom. She walked over to the stone railing, placing her steady, bare hands on the freezing granite, looking out into the vast blackness of the Washington night. A minute later, the heavy glass door clicked open behind her. A tall man in a dark green army dress uniform stepped out into the cold, his chest covered in a brilliant constellation of multicolored ribbons and silver stars. It was Colonel Sterling Cross, a highly decorated intelligence officer who had spent the last 15 years operating in the deepest shadows of the Pentagon. He stopped a few feet away from her, leaning his back against the stone railing, his eyes fixed on the distant lights of the city. "I heard what just happened in there, Evelyn," Sterling said quietly, his voice carrying the deep, gravelly tone of a man who had seen too much war. Word travels fast in a room full of intelligence officers. Gossip is the only thing that moves faster than light around here. "Let them talk, Sterling," Evelyn replied, her eyes never leaving the dark river. A room full of people, measuring their worth by the weight of the metal on their chests. It's always been that way. "You're not fine," Sterling noted, studying her profile. He knew what her calm looked like, and he knew what her controlled fury looked like. Right now, she was balanced perfectly on the knife's edge between the two. "You're out here counting the ripples on the Potomac instead of inside counting the stars on their shoulders. That's your version of being furious." Evelyn let out a low, humorless laugh that vanished into the cold wind. "He called me a stray, Sterling." A 29-year-old Navy SEAL lieutenant looked at my face, looked at my skin color, and decided I was a trespasser. He told me that people of my color used to know how to obey a man in uniform. Colonel Cross stiffened, his jaw clenching so hard that a muscle near his temple began to pulse violently. God help that boy. He has absolutely no idea whose ground he's standing on. 26 years of active service, Sterling, Evelyn whispered, her voice tightening as decades of memories flooded her mind. 3 brutal combat tours. 214 covert strategic operations over Afghanistan and Iraq. 11 months sitting in dark rooms, writing the very tactical policies that kept his SEAL teammates alive on deployments he will never even have the security clearance to know about. And he thinks I don't know what a blood price means? Sterling didn't interrupt. He had served under Evelyn Carter during the bloodiest years of the war, and he knew that when she spoke, the smartest thing any officer could do was remain silent and listen. "Do you remember Kandahar in 2005? Evelyn asked, turning her head to face him. The dim terrace light caught her eyes, and for a split second, they didn't look like the eyes of an old grandmother. They looked like they were forged from hardened carbon and cold steel. When our logistics convoy blew up in the middle of a secondary ambush, I dragged 3 bleeding Marines out of a burning, melting Humvee with my bare hands. I dislocated my left shoulder doing it, and I still carry the silver shrapnel scars in my right thigh. And do you know what the young medevac crew chief said to me when the helicopter finally landed through the smoke?" "I remember," Sterling said softly. He looked right past my rank, looked straight at my black face, and said, "Ma'am, the landing zone isn't safe for civilians. Maybe you should step aside and let the men handle the real work." I had fire burning through the soles of my combat boots, shrapnel bleeding in my arm, and a 19-year-old lance corporal dying in my lap, and that boy wanted me to step aside because I didn't look like the picture of command he had in his head. "What did you do back then?" Sterling asked with a faint, respectful smile. "I put the dying lance corporal into the helicopter myself," Evelyn said, her voice returning to its terrifyingly calm baseline. "And I dealt with the crew chief's commanding officer the following Monday morning. He spent the rest of his enlistment sorting paperwork in an unconditioned warehouse in Greenland." Sterling let out a low laugh, shaking his head. "Well, Lieutenant Vance inside hasn't learned that lesson yet. He's young, arrogant, and thinks his gold trident makes him a king. He told me he belongs to SEAL Team 9 and operated in Antarctica," Evelyn said, a small, knowing smile finally appearing on the edges of her mouth. Sterling frowned, his eyebrows twisting in confusion. "SEAL Team 9? There is no SEAL Team 9 inches the naval structure. And we don't deploy tactical operators to Antarctica. The kid is lying to puff up his chest, or he's completely delusional." "Exactly," Evelyn said, her eyes turning back to the glass doors of the ballroom. He's a boy playing dress-up in a uniform he doesn't deserve. He thinks power is something you shout from the rooftops. He doesn't understand that the most dangerous people in the room are the ones who don't need to say a word to move mountains. She checked the small silver watch on her wrist. The hands pointed exactly to 20:50 p.m. Sterling, the Joint Chief's motorcade, just cleared the final security checkpoint down the street. They will be inside the ballroom in less than 10 minutes. What are you going to do? Sterling asked, straightening his uniform. Nothing, Evelyn said smoothly, turning around and walking back toward the glass doors. I am going to let the room rearrange itself. I am going to let the loud lieutenant find out exactly what real power sounds like. Lieutenant Garrett Vance did not feel victory when Evelyn Carter walked out onto the terrace. He felt an unbearable, burning humiliation. In his twisted mind, her refusal to cry, her refusal to beg, and her quiet exit were acts of open defiance against his authority. He stood by table 12, his chest heaving under his glowing white uniform, his fingers clawing at the air. The whiskey inside his system was no longer a warm comfort. It had transformed into a volatile fuel, blinding his judgment and amplifying his worst impulses. He looked at the half-empty water glass she had left behind, and a dark, malicious urge took complete control of him. "Did you see that?" Garrett shouted, his voice slamming across the immediate radius of 5 tables, deliberately ensuring that at least 50 people heard him. He didn't care about decorum anymore. He wanted a public execution of her dignity. She walks out of here like she owns the place. No credentials, no respect for the chain of command, nothing. Just a broke old black woman sitting at a table meant for the heroes of this nation. A few tables over, Major Ellen Crawford of the United States Army turned sharply in her chair. Crawford was a 42-year-old veteran with 15 years of rigid procurement and administrative experience in the Pentagon. Her eyes were sharp as flint, her posture projecting the unyielding discipline of a woman who had survived the cutthroat politics of senior command. She looked at Garrett's reddened face, then at the gold trident pinned to his chest, her expression hardening into total disapproval. "Lieutenant," Major Crawford said, her voice dropping into a low, commanding register that carried an icy warning. "Lower your volume immediately. You are out of line, and you are creating an embarrassing scene." Garrett blinked, turning his arrogant gaze toward the female officer. Under normal circumstances, a lieutenant would snap to attention before a major, but Garrett was wrapped in the protective armor of his family's high-level connections and his elite SEAL status. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his bourbon, looking down his nose at Crawford. "With all due respect, Major, I am not making a scene. I am making a point. I am the only officer in this entire room with the actual guts to say what everyone else is thinking." "You are making an absolute fool of yourself, Vance," Crawford replied, her posture shifting into a rigid freeze, the classic micro-adjustment of a superior officer preparing a formal reprimand for later. "And in my extensive experience, junior officers who cannot tell the difference between confidence and self-destruction usually find themselves standing before a separation board. Sit down, shut your mouth, and leave that woman alone." "I refuse to sit down while our protocols are being violated," Garrett roared back, completely ignoring her order. He turned his body away from Crawford, facing the wider crowd of senators, defense contractors, and junior staff who were now openly staring at him. He raised his heavy crystal glass high into the air, treating the ballroom like his personal stage. "Am I the only one who sees a massive security problem here? We have 3-star biometric check-ins at the perimeter. We have top-secret clearance levels. We have a chain of command that our brothers in arms died to protect. And we are all just supposed to sit here quietly while an old, nameless intruder crawls out of the slums and populates a flag officer's table like she's one of us?" Silence dropped over the center of the ballroom like a heavy wool blanket. It was not the silence of agreement. It was the terrifying, hollow silence of a crowd watching a horrific car crash in slow motion. People began moving their chairs slightly away from Garrett's table, mentally calculating the blast radius of the career-ending explosion they knew was coming. Logan Foster leaned closer to Garrett, his face suddenly losing its color as he realized his friend had gone way too far. "Garrett, man, seriously, stop. Sit down, you're entering a red zone." "Get your hands off me, Logan!" Garrett snapped, violently tearing his arm free. He marched back over to table 12, just as Evelyn Carter was stepping back into the ballroom from the terrace. Before she could even take her seat, Garrett reached across the white tablecloth with an aggressive, sweeping motion. His hand caught the strap of her worn navy leather handbag, snatching it off the back of the chair with brutal force. As he pulled it toward him, his elbow struck her crystal water glass, sending it flying off the table. It shattered against the polished marble floor, with a sharp, deafening crack, splashing cold water and sharp shards across her old shoes. From the open top of her snatched handbag, a small, faded wooden box bark and yung daw tumbled out, clattering loudly against the hard floor. The lid popped open, revealing a pristine, heavy metal attached to a brilliant red, white, and blue ribbon, the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second-highest military decoration for extreme gallantry in combat. Garrett looked down at the metal, a cruel, mocking sneer twisting his lips. Instead of picking it up, he brought his heavy, polished white leather boot down directly on top of the sacred metal, grinding the metal into the marble floor with a sickening scrape. "What is this trash, Grandma?" Garrett mocked loudly, his voice echoing through the frozen room. "Did you buy this fake metal at a pawn shop for $20, just so you could sneak in here and play dress-up? Look at this garbage. You don't belong here. Get down on your knees right now, pick up your cheap bag, and wipe my boots before I have the MPs throw your old body into the street." The ballroom of the Mayflower Hotel had descended into a state of absolute breathless terror. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The classical strings of the quartet had completely died out, the musicians standing frozen with their bows hovering inches above the instruments. Every eye in the room was fixed on the horrific scene at table 12. At that moment, the crowd parted slightly as Mr. Harrison Vance, the premium luxury hotel's senior beverage and floor manager, stepped into the circle. Harrison was a tall, fastidious man in a bespoke tuxedo, whose entire career depended on keeping the military elite happy. He took one look at Garrett Vance's pristine white uniform, noticed the gold trident gleaming on his chest, and then looked down at Evelyn Carter, who stood quietly amidst the shattered glass, Garrett's boot still resting heavily on her husband's combat medal. Evelyn raised her eyes, looking directly at the manager. Her voice remained entirely calm, devoid of any panic or anger. "Manager, this officer has taken my personal property and defaced a military citation. I require your assistance." Harrison Vance swallowed hard. He looked at Garrett, then back at Evelyn's simple, insignia-free blazer and her old leather shoes. In his mind, the math was simple. A young, wealthy Navy SEAL from a powerful military family carried infinitely more weight than an elderly, ununiformed black woman who looked like she belonged in a retirement home. Harrison cleared his throat, putting on a cold, dismissive, professional smile as he turned to Evelyn. "Thuaba," Harrison said, his voice dripping with condescending corporate politeness. "I think it would be best for everyone if you followed Lieutenant Vance's instructions. Please gather your belongings and come with me immediately. I cannot have civilians causing a disruption and harassing the military elite at a private high-level event. If you do not comply, I will be forced to call armed hotel security to have you forcefully escorted from the premises." Garrett let out a loud, victorious laugh, grinding his boot harder against the velvet box on the floor. "You heard the man. Grandma, move your old legs. The trash is finally being taken out." Evelyn didn't argue. She didn't scream. She didn't even look at the manager who had just betrayed her. Instead, she slowly knelt down on the hard marble floor. Her silver hair caught the golden glare of the chandeliers as she carefully picked up the pieces of her broken handbag. Her fingers were completely steady, lacking even a micro-tremor of fear or shame. She reached under Garrett's white boot, her hand moving with a terrifying lack of hesitation. Garrett instinctively lifted his foot a fraction of an inch, surprised by her absolute fearlessness. Evelyn retrieved the wooden box, gently wiped the dust off the ribbon of the Distinguished Service Cross, and placed it securely into her pocket. She stood back up, smoothing down her navy blazer. She checked her silver wristwatch. The hands pointed exactly to 20:57 p.m. Across the room, standing near the shadows of a massive marble pillar, Colonel Sterling Cross watched the entire display with his arms crossed over his chest. His face was entirely unreadable, but a dangerous, dark light flickered in his eyes. He saw Garrett Vance laughing with Logan, saw the hotel manager Kumnum nodding to the young lieutenant, and saw the surrounding officers looking away in cowardice. Sterling slowly reached into his pocket, pulled out his encrypted Pentagon device, and sent a single, brief text message to an unlisted number. The target is fully engaged. The trap is sprung. Enter now. Evelyn Carter stood her ground by the empty table, taking a fresh glass of water from a passing waiter's tray who was too terrified to refuse her. She held the glass up to the fractured golden light of the chandelier, watching the tiny crystals reflect through the clear liquid like distant, scattered stars. She took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the icy water settle the dry atmosphere in her throat. 5 minutes, she whispered softly to herself, her voice a quiet promise that died in the hum of the air conditioning. 5 minutes, until this room completely collapses. Garrett Vance watched her drink the water, his frustration returning because her dignity remained absolutely unbroken, despite his worst efforts. "You're still standing there?" he muttered, stepping closer again. "You really are shameless, aren't you? Enjoy that water, Grandma, because it's the last thing you're going to drink inside this city, before I have your credentials permanently blacklisted from every government facility in the United States." Evelyn turned her head, looking through him as if he were made of cheap glass. "Lieutenant Vance," she said, her voice dropping into a register so deep it felt like a physical weight in the air. "You have spent the entire night speaking about the price of uniforms and the authority of badges. You have measured my worth by the color of my skin and the blankness of my chest. You genuinely believe you are climbing a mountain of glory right now. But I promise you, by the time the clock strikes 9, you will realize you have been running off a cliff." Garrett opened his mouth to deliver another cruel insult, but before the first syllable could leave his lips, a sudden, violent sound from the grand entrance of the hall cut through the air like a localized explosion. At exactly 21:00 p.m., the massive 12-foot mahogany main doors of the Freedom Hall were thrown open with a thunderous bang that caused the glass chandeliers to rattle overhead. These were not the side doors used by the catering staff, nor the service entrance near the kitchen. These were the formal ceremonial gates, polished to a mirror shine, guarded by 2 towering United States Marine Corps sentries who had stood at rigid attention all evening, like statues carved from pure duty. Simultaneously, both Marines slammed their heavy white leather heels against the marble floor with a synchronized, deafening crack that echoed across the vast ballroom like a starting pistol. "Room, attention!" the lead sentry roared, his voice carrying the terrifying force of a hurricane. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Every single conversation within the 300-guest hall died mid-sentence. Wine glasses froze halfway to lips. A senior United States senator stopped laughing. A billionaire defense contractor stopped lying. Officers, who had been leaning casually against the bars, snapped their bodies into rigid, wooden postures of total deference. The air inside the room suddenly tightened, dropping in pressure, as if the building itself had drawn a deep breath and was terrified to let it out. Lieutenant Garrett Vance instinctively snapped to attention, his military training taking complete control of his body before his alcohol-soaked brain could even process what was happening. He straightened his white dress uniform, his hand reflexively darting up to touch his gold trident, ensuring his posture was flawless. A rush of electric pride flooded his chest. This was what he lived for: the arrival of the absolute senior brass, the gods of the military machine. He felt an intense, certain conviction that one day men would freeze like this when he walked into a room. That conviction had exactly 90 seconds left to live. Walking through the heavy mahogany doors first was General Arthur Vance, no relation to Garrett, but a legend in his own right. General Vance was the chief of staff of the army, a 61-year-old warrior, built like a block of solid granite, who hadn't missed a morning physical readiness run in 4 decades. His dark green dress uniform was completely covered from pocket to shoulder in a massive, stained glass window of multicolored combat ribbons and 4 gleaming silver stars on each shoulder. He moved with a slow, deliberate gravity that made it clear everything in the universe now operated strictly on his timeline. Directly behind him walked Admiral James Whitmore, the Chief of Naval Operations. Whitmore was a lean, silver-haired man with eyes like polished surgical steel. He was a tyrant of naval discipline, a man who had ended more officers' careers with a single stroke of his fountain pen than most commanders had ever met. Garrett's entire naval existence, every evaluation report, every deployment order, and every link in his chain of command ultimately led directly back to this man's desk. Next was General Diane Solis, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, the first woman to command a global combatant command, walking with the quiet, dangerous confidence of someone who had spent 30 years being the only woman in the room and had long since stopped caring. And finally, completing the terrifying procession, came General Craig Belmont, Commandant of the Marine Corps. A man with hands the size of catcher's mitts and a battle-scarred face that looked as though it had been aggressively carved out of a mountain by a committee that approved of no one. 4 four-star generals, 16 silver stars in total. The combined constitutional and operational authority standing at the entrance of the ballroom was vast enough to launch global conflicts, reclassify entire continents, or erase an officer's entire existence before the dessert plates were cleared away. General Arthur Vance stood at the head of the group, his sharp, veteran eyes sweeping across the ballroom with the cold efficiency of a radar system scanning a battle space. He ignored the senators, he ignored the wealthy contractors, and he ignored the lines of junior officers holding their breath at rigid attention. His gaze moved methodically across the sea of white and blue uniforms, searching for one specific coordinate. Then, his eyes locked onto table 12. He saw the shattered crystal glass on the floor, the puddles of water, the overturned velvet box, and the elderly black woman standing quietly in her simple navy blazer, holding a plain glass of water. General Vance stopped walking dead in his tracks. For a man who had commanded over 200,000 troops across 3 separate bloody theaters of war, Arthur Vance did not stop walking for many people on this earth. He stopped walking for the President of the United States. He stopped walking for the Secretary of Defense. And tonight, he stopped walking for exactly one other person. He drew his massive frame to its absolute full height, pulled his shoulders back, brought his chin up, and snapped his right hand to his brow in a textbook, razor-sharp military salute. The kind of salute enlisted recruits practice until their bones ache. "Good evening, General Carter." General Vance's voice boomed across the silent hall, clear, loud, and heavy with an intense, profound reverence that cracked through the room like thunder. "The Joint Chiefs apologize for our delay. The nation owes you everything, ma'am." The ballroom did not just fall quiet. It became a vacuum where sound, breath, and time itself seemed to violently disintegrate. The silence that followed General Vance's thunderous words was absolute, heavy, and terrifyingly cellular. It was the kind of silence where the faint, rhythmic popping of champagne bubbles in a crystal glass 3 tables away sounded like a sequence of small explosions. Nobody moved a single muscle. No one dared to breathe. 300 of the most powerful military and political elites in the United States stood frozen like ice statues, their faces locked in expressions of total, unadulterated shock. Before anyone could even attempt to process the reality of what they were seeing, Admiral James Whitmore, the Chief of Naval Operations, moved into position beside General Vance. He snapped his body into a rigid frame and executed a flawless, razor-sharp naval salute. General Diane Solis followed instantly, her hand snapping to her brow with absolute mathematical precision. Finally, General Craig Belmont, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, brought his massive, scarred hand up in a salute that looked like it was forged from solid rock. 4 four-star generals, the entire upper echelon of American military might, stood in a perfect, unyielding line, saluting an elderly black woman who wore no uniform, no medals, and no visible symbols of rank. "At ease, gentlemen," Evelyn Carter said. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a natural, commanding resonance that instantly filled every corner of the massive ballroom. It was the voice of a woman who had spent decades commanding rooms far more dangerous than this one. "This is a social gala, not a tactical formation. Lower your hands before your arms get tired." The 4 generals relaxed their postures, but their faces remained completely serious, their shoulders square, standing half a step behind her, like a shield of silver and brass. The true identity of the woman at table 12 began to ripple through the crowd like an electric current passing through water. This was not a misplaced civilian. This was not an old maid or a trespasser from the slums. This was General Evelyn Carter, the first black female 4-star general in the history of the United States Armed Forces, a legendary former member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the current Deputy Secretary of Defense. She was the 3rd highest-ranking civilian official in the entire Department of Defense, possessing direct constitutional authority over every single uniformed service member in the room, every carrier strike group in the Atlantic, every combat division in the Army, and every elite special warfare unit in the Navy. Lieutenant Garrett Vance did not just turn pale. His face went entirely white, the hollow, bloodless white of ancient paper, the color of a man watching his entire identity, his career, and his future collapse into a pile of ash in real time. The heavy crystal whiskey glass in his right hand began to tremble so violently that the amber liquid crested the rim, spilling over his knuckles and sliding down into the fabric of his pristine white sleeve. He couldn't feel the cold alcohol on his skin. He couldn't feel his own feet touching the floor. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped animal, and his throat felt as dry as desert sand. "Oh my God," Logan Foster whispered behind him, his voice cracking with an intense, suffocating terror. Logan stepped 2 full feet away from Garrett, his hands shaking as he tried to separate himself from the toxic blast radius of his friend. "Garrett, what did you do? What the hell did you just do?" Garrett couldn't answer. His jaw was locked in a frozen, horizontal line, his eyes wide and bloodshot as they remained glued to the woman he had just publicly humiliated. He remembered every single disgusting word he had hurled at her face. He remembered calling her a stray, a toilet cleaner, a thief who had crawled out of the slums. And worst of all, he remembered the heavy, crushing weight of his white leather boot grinding her husband's distinguished service cross into the dirt. Mr. Harrison Vance, the premium hotel manager, who had cum nom supported Garrett just minutes ago, looked as though he was about to faint. His knees buckled slightly against his tailored tuxedo, his hands flying to his mouth to suppress a scream of terror. He had just threatened to have the Deputy Secretary of Defense forcefully dragged out of his hotel by armed security. General Arthur Vance stepped forward, his eyes locking onto the shattered glass and the water puddles surrounding table 12. His gaze drifted down to the faint scuff mark on the polished marble floor where Garrett's boot had been. The general's expression hardened into a look of such immense, controlled fury that the air around him seemed to drop by 10 degrees. "Deputy Secretary Carter," General Vance said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, low rumble that signaled an impending execution. "Is there a problem here? Why is your table in this condition?" Evelyn Carter looked down at the shattered glass, then raised her calm, steady eyes to meet Garrett's trembling gaze. The entire room held its collective breath, waiting for the word that would completely destroy the young lieutenant's life. "Nothing that cannot be corrected, General," Evelyn said smoothly, her voice completely devoid of venom, which only made the moment infinitely more terrifying. She was a sniper who didn't need to shout before she pulled the trigger. A junior officer simply forgot the true meaning of the uniform he wears. "I believe the Navy has a specific method for handling such lapses in judgment." Admiral James Whitmore did not wait for another word. He stepped out from the line of generals, his silver hair gleaming under the brilliant chandeliers, his jaw set in a hard, unyielding line. He marched directly toward the bar, where Lieutenant Garrett Vance stood frozen like a man waiting for a firing squad. The crowd of officers parted before the Chief of Naval Operations like the Red Sea, nobody wanting to be anywhere near Garrett Vance when the blade fell. "Lieutenant Vance," Admiral Whitmore said, his voice remarkably quiet, yet each word carried the precise, lethal weight of a laser-guided munition. He stopped exactly 6 inches from Garrett's face, his steel-gray eyes cutting straight through the young man's terrified soul. Garrett's body automatically snapped into a rigid attention, his heels cracking against the marble floor, but his hands were shaking so badly that he had to press them tightly against the seams of his trousers to hide the tremors. "Sir," he choked out, his voice thin and hollow. "Outside, right now," Whitmore commanded. The walk from the grand ballroom to the long marble-floored hallway of the Mayflower Hotel felt like a death march. The hallway was completely empty, lined with gold-framed oil portraits of former secretaries of defense, who seemed to look down at Garrett with absolute disdain. This was the legendary corridor where high-level military careers went to die quietly behind closed doors. Admiral Whitmore stood with his back to the portraits, his hands tucked firmly behind his back, his feet spread shoulder-width apart, the classic, terrifying posture of an admiral about to strip an officer of his honor. "Do you have any comprehension of what you did in that room tonight, Lieutenant?" Whitmore asked. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The low, structural frequency of his tone made the marble walls seem to vibrate. "Sir, I made an assumption, sir," Garrett stammered, his eyes fixed on a single brass bolt on the wall behind the admiral's shoulder, terrified to make direct eye contact. "I disrespected a civilian." "You did not just disrespect a civilian, you miserable idiot!" Whitmore's voice finally cracked like a whip, a sudden controlled burst of fury that caused Garrett to flinch. "You publicly humiliated and insulted the Deputy Secretary of Defense to her face, in front of 4 combatant commanders, 50 foreign diplomats, and 300 members of the defense establishment. You targeted her because of the color of her skin and the simplicity of her clothes. You disgraced the United States Navy, you disgraced the special warfare community, and you disgraced every man who has ever worn that gold trident on your chest." Garrett's throat worked convulsively, but no sound came out. The alcohol had completely evaporated from his system, leaving behind nothing but a cold, paralyzing dread. "And to make your disgusting display even more pathetic," Whitmore continued, stepping closer until Garrett could feel the cold breath of his superior officer, "you stood in that room and lied about being a member of SEAL Team 9. You claim to have led secret operations in Antarctica. There is no SEAL Team 9, Vance. We do not deploy special operators to a non-militarized continent. You are a 29-year-old child who invented a fantasy world to feed your own pathetic, fragile ego, because you couldn't stand the sight of an old black woman possessing more dignity than you will ever have in your entire existence." Garrett felt tears of absolute shame burning behind his eyes, but he forced them back, his jaw clenching so tight that his teeth ached. "I made a catastrophic error in judgment, sir. You made a career-ending display of arrogance and racism, Lieutenant." Whitmore corrected him coldly. "Effective immediately. You are suspended from all operational duties. Your commanding officer at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado will be notified before sunrise. Your security clearance is revoked, pending a formal review by the Inspector General. You will be stripped of your deployment status, and you will face a formal board of inquiry for conduct unbecoming an officer. Garrett felt the floor beneath him open up, his entire life's work turning to dust in a single sentence. Yes, sir. And before you pack your bags and leave this city, Whitmore added, his voice returning to a razor-sharp whisper, you will write a formal, handwritten letter of apology to Deputy Secretary Carter. Not an email, Vance. A handwritten letter delivered directly through my office. If she decides to file criminal charges under the Uniform Code of Military Justice for your behavior, I will personally ensure you spend your remaining years staring at the walls of a military brig. Dismissed. Admiral Whitmore turned on his heel and walked back toward the ballroom, his heavy footsteps echoing down the long marble hallway until they faded into nothingness. Garrett stood completely alone in the silent corridor, his chest heaving, his hands falling to his sides. He looked down at the gold trident pinned to his chest. The metal caught the soft yellow light of the wall sconces and glowed. But for the first time in his life, it didn't feel like a badge of glory. It felt like a block of solid lead, crushing him into the earth. The heavy mahogany door to the private holding room on the second floor of the Mayflower Hotel opened with a soft click at exactly 22:15 p.m. The room was small and quiet, furnished with deep leather armchairs, a dark mahogany desk, and a large window that looked out over the black, slow-moving waters of the Potomac River. Deputy Secretary Evelyn Carter sat behind the desk, reviewing military readiness numbers on a secure Pentagon tablet. The grand gala downstairs was already fading into the background of her immense schedule. It was merely one event among thousands in a career built on real duty. Garrett Vance stepped through the doorway. He was still wearing his dress whites, but the posture of the cocky SEAL was entirely gone. His shoulders were slumped forward, his face was hollow and drained of all color, and his eyes were fixed securely on the carpet. He stopped exactly 3 paces from the desk, drew his trembling body into a rigid attention, and executed a slow, deliberate salute. This salute was not like the ones he had given before, reflexive, casual, and arrogant. This was the salute of a man who was choosing, for the very first time in his life, to mean it. Madame Deputy Secretary, Garrett said, his voice cracking slightly on the words. Evelyn did not look up from her tablet immediately. She let him hold the salute for 5 long, suffocating seconds, allowing the absolute weight of his actions to settle into the silence of the room. Then, she slowly lowered her tablet and returned the salute with a brief, efficient movement of her hand. "Sit down, Vance," she said softly. Garrett sat in the leather chair across from her, his hands gripping his knees so tightly that his knuckles turned completely white. He swallowed hard, trying to find the words he had spent the last hour writing and rewriting in his head. "Ma'am, I am here to offer you my deepest, most sincere apologies," Garrett said, his voice shaking. "What I said to you tonight at that table, the way I treated you, the words I used, it was completely unacceptable. It was disgusting. It was racist. And it was entirely beneath the standard of the uniform I wear and the nation I swore to protect. I am deeply sorry for defacing your husband's medal. I have no excuse for my actions, ma'am." Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her dark eyes studying his face with a quiet, penetrating focus that lacked any anger. "Why did you join the Navy, Garrett?" she asked suddenly. The question knocked him entirely sideways. He had prepared himself for a brutal, screaming match, a surgical tearing down of his character, or a cold announcement of his court-martial. He had not prepared for a quiet conversation. My family has always served, ma'am," Garrett stammered, his voice dropping into a lower, unscripted tone. "My grandfather was an admiral. My father was a captain. I grew up in a big house in Virginia, surrounded by medals and portraits. I wanted to be like them. I wanted everyone to look at me and know that I was important. I wanted to be a man that people noticed the second I walked into a room. You wanted to be important, Evelyn repeated softly, a faint, knowing smile appearing on the edges of her lips. Your father was Captain Thomas Vance. He commanded the USS Winston during the Mediterranean deployment 15 years ago. He was a good man, Garrett, quiet, diligent. He spent his entire career working in the dark, never dropping his name to impress defense contractors, never using his family's connections to skip a difficult deployment, and never requiring a room to freeze before he felt respected. He earned the devotion of his sailors not because of the stars on his shoulders, but because of the dignity with which he treated every single human being under his command. Garrett's head snapped up, his eyes widening in total disbelief. You knew my father? He served directly under my strategic command during the Persian Gulf logistics reorganization, Evelyn said, her voice softening into a tone of deep, hard-earned respect. He was an exceptional officer because he understood a truth that you have completely forgotten, Lieutenant. A uniform is not a weapon to be used to crush the weak. A badge is not a license to look down on people who do not look like you. True power does not shout from the rooftops, and real respect cannot be demanded through arrogance. Your father never needed a gold trident to make people see his worth. He was respectable because of his character, quietly, consistently, every single day. A single tear finally escaped Garrett's eye, sliding down his pale cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. The realization of how deeply he had disgraced his father's legacy tore through his heart far worse than any military punishment. I am not going to destroy your career, Garrett, Evelyn said quietly, turning her gaze back to her tablet. Admiral Whitmore's formal review will proceed. The letters of reprimand will be placed in your permanent file, and your operational suspension will stand for the next 6 months. Those consequences are non-negotiable. Actions have weight, and tonight, your actions were exceptionally heavy. But I will not request a dishonorable discharge. I will not make the phone call that ends your military life before you have had a chance to learn how to be a real officer. Garrett looked at her, his voice choked with emotion. Why, ma'am? After what I did, why would you give me a single inch of grace? Because your father earned that grace through a lifetime of honorable service, Evelyn said, standing up from her desk and extending her hand across the table. And because I have to believe that the son of Thomas Vance is capable of becoming the man his father already was. Phẩm giá của một con người, Garrett, không bao giờ phụ thuộc vào địa vị, màu da hay cái ghim vàng trên ngực áo. Hãy ghi nhớ điều đó. Garrett stood up, his body completely straight. He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm but his hand trembling with a profound, life-changing gratitude. One last piece of advice, Lieutenant, Evelyn said, releasing his hand. Rank doesn't make you dangerous. Arrogance doesn't make you strong. Silence and respect do. Learn to use them. Garrett nodded, unable to speak through the tight knot of emotion in his throat. He turned, walked to the door, and stepped out into the long, empty marble hallway, closing the door softly behind him. As he walked down the corridor, his shoulders, the shoulders that had carried the weight of an elite trident all evening, like a crown of supreme arrogance, straightened in a completely different way. It was a posture that was quieter, older, and humbler. It was a posture that his father would have finally recognized. This unforgettable story teaches us that true human dignity is never defined by the titles we hold, the medals pinned to our chests, or the color of our skin. True power does not need to shout, humiliate, or oppress others to feel important. The most powerful people in the room are often the ones who carry themselves with quiet respect, protecting the vulnerable rather than crushing them. Arrogance can destroy a career in a single evening, but humility and respect can rebuild a soul for a lifetime. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the true value of justice and human dignity, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another deeply moving story. Thank you for watching, and stay blessed.